So the web design process is a lot like the regular design process, but there are a few key differences here that we can talk about for interaction design specifically. And in this course, we'll use those terms interchangeably. Web design and app design are just forms of designing for interaction that are screen based. So anytime I say web design, I'm also talking about application design. So we are still working with the same design models that we have talked about before. This is the 5-step model that I like: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. But there's a few key points of emphasis in here that we can talk about for interaction design, particularly in the empathize, prototype, and testing phases, where these things are especially important when we're designing for interaction. We can still think about this as a double diamond approach to design, where we are both divergent and convergent thinking. So thinking back to those definitions, divergent thinking is where we are thinking in a generative context, where we are coming up with new ideas and searching broadly. And then convergent thinking is when we are narrowing our focus or looking for an example of truth or the right fit for a solution. When we empathize in web design, usually we're trying to better understand the problem and, in particular, the users and how they interact with a system. So we still need to understand the people that we're designing for, which is usually a client or a boss or a team or somebody. But more importantly, oftentimes we need to talk to the users of a site or app and see how they interact with it and understand what that actual process is for them. Define. Often you're being asked to design a thing rather than to solve a problem, but you shouldn't take this at face value. Oftentimes you'll be asked to design a website or an app, and that's kind of like the baseline of like, hey, we need a website for this thing. And the person asking you hasn't always thought through why they need a website, or in particular, what it is that they want that website to do. So it's really important for us as designers to step in and work on that design brief and revisit that stage as often as necessary to really frame that problem and make sure that we're defining the problem in the right way that gets our client or our stakeholders the best possible outcome. Some things we can ask ourselves to do that better is to ask what the website needs to do, to think about what information we need to present in order to do that, and then to think through how that information needs to be organized on the website. A sitemap is a form of showing information architecture, where we're thinking about the various pages of a site and how those pages are organized. For example, do we have to go through certain pages to get to other ones? You can't get to the checkout page on a site without going through your cart, for example. There are a few tools that are helpful for us when we're making these. You can use Figma or Glue Maps or pen and paper and sticky notes. Whatever works best for you is a fine way to do this information architecture work. Wireframes are kind of like sitemaps, but for individual pages. So they give us a skeleton of the page so we can imagine the types of content that are here without actually creating that content. These can be sketches, but increasingly it's becoming more and more common to do these digitally because it's just as fast. But I recommend really don't skip that sketching phase because, again, our tools show up in the things that we make. When you're starting to think about what these pages look like, unless you know for a fact that you're designing a desktop application or that most of your users will be on a desktop, you should always design mobile first. And what that means is you should put your focus on the mobile version of the site, and then once that's done, expand it to the desktop layout. The reason we do that is because Increasingly, mobile traffic is the largest percentage of traffic on websites, and our interactions on mobile are also more limited. It's a smaller screen real estate, and so we really have to think about what's most important to show the user. We can't fit everything there at once, and that helps us think through the hierarchy of information on the page. We're also limited in terms of types of interactions we can have. For example, on a mobile phone, you don't have an ability to hover over a button or to hover over something to reveal information. We have taps and we have drags, and that's pretty much it. On the desktop version, we can add in those other types of interaction, but we should make sure that we can solve for the most limited circumstance first and then expand later. A step beyond mood boards, but is still in the ideation phase, are what we call style tiles. These are a deliverable that help us bridge the gap between mood boards and full prototypes. And it allows us to demonstrate our new and unique visual language without putting together an entire layout. These are quick and easy to make, and they're really great things to deliver to your clients early before you start working on a full layout. Some things that make sense to include here, and again, this differs by project, so you'll play it by ear on each project that you work on. Things like typographic treatment, color palettes, descriptive adjectives of the voice that you are going for with the design, a few components of types of interactions that would appear on the site. For example, what are your buttons going to look like? What might your form fields look like? Photography and treatment of photography, and what icon sets you'll use if you're going to use them. These are some examples from your reading. Again, these are different examples of style tiles for the same project, and you can see how each is showing the same types of information, but each one has a different voice to it depending on the colors, the typefaces chosen, and the layouts here. These are some other examples. Again, it depends on the project for what you put on these. You have to decide what makes sense for your project. And then these are some style tiles that I've actually delivered to clients and were super helpful in moving our project forward. So this was for a annual report, not necessarily a website, but accomplished some of the same things, thinking about, what types of photography and treatment were we going to use? What colors did we want the report to use most prominently? And then how is our typographic treatment going to drive the layouts of the pages? Prototyping. Prototyping is fun because this is where we start to get into showing the actual interaction of an app or a website. These can be super low fidelity in terms of something like a pen and paper prototype, but nowadays, especially with tools like Figma, we can make prototypes that almost look like the real thing. So in web design, prototyping helps us accomplish two things. One is communicating what the final site will look like after it's developed. And two, prototyping the interactions communicates how it should function, not just how it should look. And it's not necessarily that one of these should come before the other. Sometimes you will prototype interactions and user flows before you work on the visuals. Sometimes you need to have the visuals in place for those interactions to make sense to the user. Interaction should always be meaningful. Don't just add in interactivity because you can. Interaction is a type of communication, and it's easy to distract users or to build in complexity to a project when we don't need to. So, for example, a meaningful interaction could be progressive disclosure, or we have something like a drop-down that reduces information density on the page to help the user focus on what they need to, but reveals information as it makes sense. Something like a drop-down menu would make sense there. Interaction helps us navigate, helps point users where they need to go, and can also help draw attention or slow the user down during a process. What interaction really is a form of conversation with the user. So this is a refresher on our complex conversation model. In interaction design, our back and forth is not between two people or the viewer and the design, but is through the application and the user. What we're trying to do when we design a website or an app is make sure that our conceptual model of how the thing works matches the user's model for how it works. If you've ever expected an app to do something when you click a button and it does something totally different, that's a frustrating experience. And what's happening there is the model of the application is different from your mental model of what you were expecting it to do. When we prototype, we are trying to get feedback through visual representation of our designs, and we are trying to provide rough functionality so that we can test the interaction with users. Testing is a super important thing in interaction design because interaction is hard. We'll talk more about this, but usability testing is really important. So what we do is we put together a prototype that functions in some sort of way or has some sort of flow that the user needs to go through. We put it in front of users, we ask them to complete that task, and then we just watch them and see what they do. It's a form of critique. So usually what happens is the usability testing goes completely different than what you were expecting. You'll discover a new issue or a bug in the development or something, and then you have tasks to work on when you go back to designing.